different things on notebooks. Everything on the
Do
fine.
you guys want me to start or?
Yes. I thought we started.
No.
Yeah,
Starting,
please
or
do.
do you want me
Please
to
do.
just?
Yeah, please do.
I wasn't sure what we were.
No, we're good. You got us, Dino. Yeah. I'll be right back. I'm gonna walk out.
Sure, as you wish. So thank you guys again. Neville always kind of brings me in to kind of clean up things at the end and kind of fill in the gaps. A lot of times what happens is you have all these folks coming in and they're doing a lot of presentations on different things. They use different words, different contexts. So what I'm going to try to do is kind of fill in the holes.
Oh, thank you.
That's kind of my goal, is to kind of fill in the holes and kind of add a little bit so that way you guys kind of get a broader understanding. They're talking with specifics, BLM, forest, this and that. And I kind of come from a broader perspective to try to understand what's going on. A lot of what these folks are talking about is the regulatory environment, whether it's VVWRA, whether it's BLM, whether it's the folks who are working in field to try and create that biological corridor. A lot of it has to do with the regulatory environment. And so what we're going to do today is just kind of touch upon the regulatory environment, try to understand, because it's probably one of the most important areas when you're looking at environmental policy and how policy is implemented in these different agencies. So honestly, when you look at the role of government, there's 5 different ways that the government implements or does not implement environmental policy. And you can kind of see it as a continuum in regards to their policy efforts. So the first one that you see is that they're completely unregulated. You know, a completely unregulated market, for example, would be something of the oceans themselves. Ocean management is completely unregulated. There is nobody or one entity that is actually managing our world's oceans. That one presenter earlier, you notice that she said there was a big garbage patch,
Yeah.
right? That was out there. That's the size of Texas. Nobody manages that. You see what I'm saying? There's no authority that manages. That's completely unregulated. Yes.
So that the BLM
Does not manage the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. You see what I'm saying?
Okay.
The BLM, as an authority, we have sovereignty or we have control as the United States up to 12 miles, and then we have an exclusive economic zone of 200 miles
When you say we,
as the United States.
oh, okay.
Yep. So every country, and thank you for saying that, every country gets 12 miles off their coast. That's their sovereign area. So no ship can enter 12 miles within of our coast. Once you're 12 miles outside the coast, then you're in international waters. However, you get what's called an exclusive economic area, exclusive economic zone, up to 200 miles that you can use for like offshore drilling or fishing or stuff like that. But once you get past that 200 miles, there really isn't any agency that manages the oceans, just to give an example. Yeah.
Past 200 miles, international water.
Past 12 miles, it's international water.
International water basically doesn't belong to anyone.
Doesn't belong to anybody. However, what they've decided upon at the United Nations was that nations can have up to 200 miles to exploit any economic resources. So, you know, Japan can officially fish within 200 miles of their coast. You see what I'm saying? Anything beyond that, it's international. You guys understand what I'm saying? So that's one end of the continuum. Completely unregulated. Completely unregulated. There's just nobody watching this area. Now, she did mention about that big ocean, right? That big patch of trash.
Yeah.
For example, that was, she said was about, you know what, about the size of Texas. There was an article that came out today. That was very interesting. The article that came out today argued that they're actually seeing a breakdown in the plastic, and they're not quite sure why. They don't understand why.
I don't know why, but somebody told me, I don't know how true it is, but they said some of the plastic bags are trying to make that of some kind of corn or biodegradable
Oh, sure, yeah.
product to where it could break down faster.
Yeah, they make plastic forks and plastic knives in that atmosphere.
Well, they said plastic bags too, so I was like,
But these bags that are circulating in the ocean are not those bags. These bags, and they're saying that's not just plastic from bags; it's plastic
Like
from
the bottle,
everything.
Any kind of plastic, and then it's going down to tiny
Tiny, yeah.
Fish are eating it,
Yeah.
and it's coming back into our system. So then it's becoming.
But they're saying that a good chunk of it's disappearing, and they don't understand why. They hypothesized in this article a couple of scholars, that it may be that fish are taken into deeper parts of the ocean that we just don't know about. Does that make sense? But large portions of trash that we see are circulating in these oceans, they're actually disappearing and we're not sure why.
And is it that bad news for us to find out? Is
I
that
don't
gonna-
know. I don't have an answer. Actually, I'm not a scientist in that aspect. It's just what I read. And what I've read is that they don't even know themselves. They have to investigate this further. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that this is disappearing? We don't know. No idea. Of course, I often employ what's called the precautionary principle. I will tend to assume that it's possibly a bad thing, hoping it's a good thing, but plan as if it's a bad thing. I'm not sure what's going on, where this plastic is disappearing. The argument is that the fish that are eating it are actually going into deeper parts of the ocean, and then when it comes out of the fish, it's actually in the deeper parts of the ocean, so it's not being recirculated, in other words. What effect that's going to have long term, I have no idea. Couldn't tell you for the life of me. I really don't know. But this is what you're seeing. Now, there is also what we call use of market forces with some government control. Now, the use of market forces with some government control is based on the idea that we can have some privatization, we can have some market forces that manage the resource, yet there's some kind of government controls to keep the market from quote-unquote consuming itself. You know what I mean? In other words, we allow certain private entities to have, they are the ones who essentially develop the policy in regards to that area, and the government somewhat helps them to try and maintain that policy. So this is where market forces themselves kind of determine what's best for that particular environmental area. Then you see government controls on the state and local levels. Government controls on the state and local level. This is actually what you've seen from about the 1930s all the way up till about the 1990s. You really saw government, a lot of policy was based on what happened at the state and local level. This is why a lot of these folks still talk about CEQA, right? The California Environmental Quality Act versus the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, because these state and local controls still matter. Then the next level on the continuum are government controls developed on the national level and then implemented on state and local. This started really picking up steam in the 90s and the 2000s, where you saw national, federal government, especially under Bill Clinton's administration, saying, here's what you guys are going to do at the local level. Trying to manage what's happening. Because what do you think might be a downfall of only implementing things at the state and local level?
You're going to get irregular patterns.
Irregular patterns of policies between states. And unfortunately, are resources only limited to one state, or are they often shared by a state?
Shared.
Let's look at the Colorado River. Is it unique just to California? No, it's shared by 7 states, correct? Which means you can't develop a California water policy without having a Arizona water policy or Nevada water policy. What happens if they all conflict?
Then
It's chaos, right? So that's why the national government stepped in and sort of started implementing national policy, national controls over state and local controls back in the 90s and 2000s. And then the last step in this continuum, right? Think of this as government not involved and government completely controls at this level. This is a continuum, right? Controls developed and implemented on the national level, total national control. The federal government controls it 100%. There's very few areas that are like this. I'll give you an example of one area where the federal government has total national control and no one can say anything to the national government, and that is the production of nuclear energy. The states do not have a right to tell the federal government anything when it comes to producing nuclear energy. Do you guys see this? So when they shut down that nuclear power plant down there by where I live, the San Onofre nuclear power plant, that was not a state of California decision. You know, that was not a state of Nevada decision. That was a U.S. government decision. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission shut down the San Onofre nuclear power plant.
Do they have any say as far as like not wanting it
No.
in their state?
No, the states can sue, right? They can sue to say not in my backyard,
Yeah.
and states do that all the time. In fact, back in the 1970s, Congress decided that they were going to store all of the nuclear waste produced in this country in something called the Yucca Mountains, about 70 miles north of Las Vegas. Back then, Vegas was probably 100,000 people, so it wasn't that real big of a deal. And then what happened is the state of Nevada sued, saying you can't impose your federal will on us. And the federal government said, hey, you know what? We have total control over the production of nuclear energy, including waste. Therefore, if we want to store it in Nevada, we will. Why did Nevada sue? Because by the time they wanted to start putting that waste in the Yucca Mountains, Vegas had grown from about 100,000 to like 1.2 million people. And so 1.2 million people weren't very comfortable with having all of the nation's nuclear waste 70 miles north of it. And they've dug these huge like caves, pits to put this stuff in. Because the rock formation at that time was considered the most stable. Further research has shown that it's not as stable as they thought it was, but nevertheless, that's what they thought. And so Nevada sued and said Nevada won in the Supreme Court in the 1990s. And they said that you can't impose federal will, especially when it's going to endanger the health and the environment of the state.
So where'd it go?
Nowhere. Actually, every single nuclear power plant or nuclear power generating facility is responsible for its own waste. And they usually keep it on site. Yeah, we don't have a national policy that's effective enough to deal with this. Because where would you want to put it? Where would you like to put it? It's against to become what? A NIMBY attitude, right? Not in my backyard, and for darn good reasons, right? Who wants?
What happens because they have a NIMBY attitude is then at San Onofre, they have huge levels of low-grade waste sitting in swimming pools. They're in pools there, sitting at San Onofre. If you know where San Onofre is, if somebody did a low-level attack on that, we'd have a low-level nuclear problem all over the whole of Southern California. 15 million people. So we actually created a much bigger potential problem.
Yep. But where do you put it? I mean, they're thinking about exporting it. The French, they often, what the French do is they reprocess their uranium, and you can reprocess uranium-238 and turn it into plutonium-239. And then when you reprocess it to plutonium, plutonium actually produces more energy. So the French, with 100% nuclear waste, by reprocessing the uranium-238 to plutonium-239, they actually end up with only about 4% nuclear waste.
So
Yeah, Tim?
Isn't the U.S. the only country that doesn't reprocess its nuclear waste?
Correct. You got that right. We are the only nuclear power that does not reprocess its nuclear waste. That's absolutely true. You know why, Tim?
Because we're stupid?
Nope. We don't have to import uranium. You know where they dig it up at? Native American reservations in Arizona. When they started digging up the uranium in Native American reservations in the 1950s, they left them as open pits. Native Americans have been suffering from cancer rates for 50 years because of these open pits. It wasn't until the Superfund sites were established in the 80s that finally said enough's enough at these Native American reservations in Arizona. I think it's the Apache Indian, forgive me if I'm not sure, that they have been suffering from the sicknesses from exposure to uranium. Yeah, isn't that sad? We don't have to go get uranium. You know where France gets its uranium from? Niger in Central Africa. We don't have to. We get it from Arizona. So because it's so cheap and so big, well, I would want to say cheap. Relatively speaking, it's cheaper than it is for, like, let's say France or Great Britain to get uranium. We don't reprocess it. But France does because it's much more expensive. France just has a better energy policy all around it. Frankly, because they have to. Necessity is right the mother of invention. It just truly is.
So, but wouldn't it be better if we did recycle our because then we can lower the possibility of a terroristic threat or something.
Just so you know, the trend is moving away from nuclear energy. Japan's moving away from nuclear energy. Germany's moving away from nuclear energy. France is moving away from nuclear energy. This is a very odd thing that you're seeing. The trend was towards nuclear energy. Now you're seeing a move away from nuclear energy. Why do you think that's the case worldwide?
It's a threat.
Couple of things. No, not really the threat so much. I think the threat thing is overplayed, to be honest with you.
Because we have better resources now and better.
So first thing is what happened in Japan. Yeah, Fukushima. That sent a warning signal to every country. Like, if that could happen in Japan, which Japan had the best standards for earthquake, right? And they still struggle. If that could happen in Japan, it's going to happen in California. First. Second thing is fracking. Natural gas is just so cheap. It makes no economic sense to produce expensive nuclear power plants when you could frack the Monterey Shell Formation up here in Central California and get enough natural gas to last 100 years.
Frack, is that a process?
So fracking is a problem. We're all way off topic, by the way. But,
Well, where the frack are we going with this?
where the frack are we going? We're way off topic. But I'm okay as long as you guys are okay. I just don't want to keep you here all night. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That was awesome. By the way, he's the one who said,
Yeah.
"Hey, Linda, why don't you go ahead?" So, yeah,
I already spoke to him.
all right. So,
I think I called her
You can
Judy.
stay in
They're
class.
Judy, that's right. You awaken the South African lion. You know, so watch out. So fracking is a new technological invention of the past 10 years. Well, what they do is they actually, through geological testing, they find rocks that contain quite a bit of oil within the rock itself. And so what you could do is take the rock and smash it, which has been done before, and basically like a pimple, you squeeze it out. You know what I mean? That's literally what you've seen. Or the less expensive method is to actually go into the rock formation and crack it. And then when you crack it, you expose the oil, right? And then what you do is you send chemicals down there that the oil bonds to, and then you suck it back out with a vacuum. And then what happens is you have to separate that chemical from the oil. Then you got to take the chemical and refine it. Then you got to refine it even further. And then you can see how messy of a process fracking is. Fracking is an extremely messy process. Not very environmentally friendly at all. I'm going to offer a correlation here that has not been substantiated, yet people are investigating this. There's been a rash of earthquakes in the Midwest. A lot of these are close to where fracking is being taking place in the Midwest, in the Dakotas and Nebraska. That may be a false correlation. Does that make sense? It may not be true, but people are starting to wonder, is there a correlation between fracking and these earthquakes? Possibly not. Does that make sense? There's a lot more variables that go into why an earthquake takes place than just fracking. But they're investigating to see whether or not there may be a link. You can't establish causality. Remember we talked about that? But there might be a correlation, and if there is, it's worth investigating. There's a logic to it. Does that make sense? There's a logic to this, but again, you have to test these things out. You just can't say it is. You have to hypothesize and then research and then provide evidence that it's so, if we want to establish some kind of scientific basis.
I thought that was a huge contention against fracking.
Fracking is extremely contentious.
But not so much so that we move towards it.
Well, I don't know, because California doesn't frack. I mean, but there's been some talk of.
Actually, we do frack.
We do?
Yeah, we frack in the most environmentally sensitive place, right off Santa Barbara. They're fracking right there.
Yeah.
We have to use
Though Jerry Brown has been talking about expanding it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's recently what Jerry Brown's talking about is expanding.
Not on a large scale.
Yeah, you're talking about the lands that have already been opened up, that have been, standard
And in
oil.
Bakersfield, they're fracking, but
Yeah.
that's not on new.
Yeah,
not a-
this is land that's already been used for oil.
Now we're getting the low grade stuff.
Correct. They're talking about opening up
Yeah.
large areas.
I thought he was trying to do was still even, people wanted to go with, because they have to, it's a natural resource they have to utilize to frack. I mean, it's not so much, oh, this land's already ruined for oil, we can frack on it. It's we have to use millions of tons of water to frack and all this other stuff.
Trade-offs. Trade-offs. If you look in North Dakota, their economy is booming. Lots of high-paying jobs. If you're to ask these folks in the Central Valley, if they want a job making $100 grand a year and at the cost of fracking, what do you think their answer might be? This is what politicians have to contend with. The possible effects of fracking on the environment vis-a-vis the economic livelihoods of the people who vote for them. I would not want to be a politician because they really struggle. Well, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Right? You know, what do you do? I don't have an answer. I'm just going to be honest with you. All right, good. So that's the continuum that you see. Now, remember we talked about what is a common resource, right? Remember we talked about the, last week I showed you guys, it was the last week or the week before, I showed you guys kind of a video, right?
Yeah. That's
Right? What was that video on?
The paradox of the commons.
What? The commons, right? What happens? Say it again.
The tragedy of the commons.
Tragedy of the commons, right? Tragedy of the commons. So we all try to avoid a tragedy of the commons. Now, what's a commons again? Do you remember?
It's a land that everybody can use.
What's that?
A land that everybody can use.
Land that everybody can use. That's right. And so, did we identify a number of problems, right, with this?
Yes.
Definitely, right? There are people who free ride. What does free riding mean?
They
That
take
use
on
more
their
than
share.
they can use.
People who use more than they need to, or they use without contributing, correct? So people free ride and they can end up using the common resources, right? and then what happens is you have a tragedy that occurs. Remember we talked about that? So what are some of the solutions then that you see brought forward in the regulatory environment to deal with these common pool resource problems? Well, the first approach is self-regulation. This is a reliance on self-interest and volunteerism. And experience shows that unfortunately volunteerism is not always a reliable solution to common pool problems. Why do you think volunteerism often in the end doesn't work?
Because it can be misdirected.
Okay, it can be misdirected. What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, people ask me, you don't have to necessarily have to go through a standard or
So these
regulatory
two good
process.
folks, I wish they had stayed.
Yeah.
They want to develop a biological corridor up between Phelan and Pinion Hills, and I missed some of their lecture. And why are they developing the corridor?
Because that's where they live, and they realized that's a critical.
For which particular species?
No, water percolation.
Water percolation.
No, actually, in the original, it was to protect their livestock, their rural living livestock, because they rode their horses, they enjoyed the land, they wanted to use that land in its untouched.
Are there quite a few people who live in Phelan, Pinion Hills that own their own property?
Yeah.
You do? Okay. So are they relying a lot on volunteers to keep their places rural, to not want to develop them or sell them out, right? What happens then? Is everyone going to agree to volunteer to do this over time? What's going to happen over time, you think?
Just a few people.
Run out of volunteers.
You're going to run out of volunteers, right? So self-regulation is the first way to solve a common pool resource problem like what these good folks are doing in Phelan and Pinion Hills. Of course, what's the problem with that? Yeah, volunteering doesn't last for long, right? Because eventually people's self-interest take over. A second approach is a standard of enforcement, or what we call command and control of environmental regulation. This is essentially that some government unit determines what the appropriate level of pollutant or activity is, set the standards, and then establishes a way to enforce these standards. When we think regulation, this is what we think of. We think government steps in and what? Takes over and then sets a standard and then finds a way to enforce it. Can you give me an example of something like this?
Code enforcement.
Code enforcement, right? And in terms of the environment, think of something.
Clean Water Act.
Clean Water Act, right? In other words, the folks over here from VVWROA, what was her name?
Kate Fire.
Kate Meyer. Water and sewage is heavily regulated. It's command and control. What command and control means is that the government commands the water resource and controls how it's used. And what happens if the VVWROA does not conform to the standards set forward by the government? They will be fined. Hey Neville,
Sorry.
was the VVWRA, has it been fined recently?
Yes.
What's it been fined for?
It got fined for,
That water pipe.
yeah, for not maintaining its NPDES thing because the sewage pipe broke.
Yep.
It was interesting because it wasn't even their fault that it broke.
Correct. But command and control system is this idea that the government commands a water resource, controls it, and if they control it through a system of regulations and they enforce it through fines. How much was Logan and the VVWRA
The
fine?
original fine was $1 million.
$1 million. And if I remember Logan correctly saying it's $1 million per incident, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. Is that correct? Since that was one incident, it was $1 million, and I think they were able to reduce it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they pretty much, a lot of this mitigation stuff they're doing, all these good practices, they were able to show that, and I think they pretty much got off most of it.
So that's one way to manage. That's how they manage water, for example.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Now let's see another way you can manage the common pool that exists. This would be taxes, or effluent charges, or some other kind of monetary measure that would provide polluters with an incentive to find the most cost-effective means for limiting the pollution. In other words, you tax pollution, which is new. That's a relatively new concept. You are actually taxed per credit of pollution, and that's relatively new. And so if you can then lower the amount of taxes you pay by reducing your pollution. So then corporations have an incentive to try and reduce their pollution. Now, it's not command and control, is it? No, and it's not self-regulation. It's actually taxing effluents or taxing what is produced afterwards. And so if you have a lot of waste wood, or let's say granite, Or let's say, you have a lot of waste product. In construction projects, there's a lot of waste project. 50% of all the materials used in a construction project, let's say a home, is waste. It used to be that they just take that stuff to the dump and got rid of it. Now what happens is they recycle it, because now you go to the dump and you pay a lot. There's a lot of taxes now levied on these dumps that they pass on to the consumers. Do you see this? Or they will tax builders like Lennar Homes. They will tax these folks, KB Homes, and say, what are you doing? And we'll lower your taxes if you do something with this waste. And they show that they have, and they get receipts. What do you guys think? It's not bad, right?
Yeah.
So it's another way to try and regulate a common problem. A fourth way is what we call common property rights. This is where participating individuals share in the costs associated with the administration of the resources, enforcement of the rules, and monitoring. A classic example of a common property rights is what you would call a housing association. What do they call it? Homeowners association, an HOA. A homeowners association is the classic example of a common property rights. Homeowners association. They can do these type of associations with the environment as well. They can set up some type of environmental ownership association where everybody who participates in the use of this particular resource, they tax themselves, they regulate themselves. Usually the government may or may not endorse it. Usually the government does. But they actually, it's not self-regulation, it's a step above self-regulation. Does that make sense? What they're doing is actually coming together and establishing a common property rights. That we all own access to this particular waterfall. Or we all own access to this particular part of the mountains. We all share in it. You see what I'm saying? But it's not run by the government. It's privately held. Okay? The last one is simply you can just get rid of the commons. Usually one of the most effective ways to solve the common pool resource problems is by literally not making it common, which means it's not available to anybody. Remember, what makes it a tragedy of the commons is that it's available to everyone, right? And then when people use up more than they should, it becomes a tragedy. Therefore, sometimes just turn everything over to property rights. Of course, you can't do that with certain things, right? You can't do that with the ocean. You can't do that with air, correct? But some areas where they've been talking about doing this is with forest management. Some folks have argued, just turn the forest over to the timber companies. That if you turn the forest over to the timber companies, they argue that they may manage it better than the U.S. National Forest Service. They argue, these folks, that it's in their natural interest to properly harvest, reseed, and nourish the lands that they manage. Others argue, though, that the drive for short-term profits to satisfy shareholders, pay off bonds, or enhance careers of executives will outweigh the long-term profit and loss considerations. So what do you guys think? What's your thoughts? Because this is another way. If you truly want to protect the commons, don't make it a common anymore. Hand it over to somebody who can do a better job of managing it. But what do we assume? That they're going to do a better job of? Yeah, and we worry that they won't. That's correct.
Because that's sort of like saying, like trusting banks then to act appropriately, because they want to see the economy do well, so that they don't do well.
That's correct.
In essence, it never works out with that.
That's correct. And what we do is when the government intervenes and regulates money, we now say that money is a common resource. Money is a common resource that no longer can be just held by private people, that the government now has to intervene and regulate because private people have failed to properly manage this common resource, and we have a tragedy on our hands, in this case the Great Recession. Do you see how this concept is applied to many different areas? We're talking only environment, but can you apply the concept of a commons to other areas?
Oh, yeah.
Sure, education is one of them, is it not? You can easily apply the concept of a commons to other areas around your life. Very easily.
I just pulled like little America land and free thing, but.
America!
America, I'm sorry, but if you make everything privatized land, then let's for once not go with precautionary control and say, what if they do a better job? Well, even if they do a better job of taking care of it, then we're no longer a free country, everything's privatized, so it's owned by someone or the other. In which case,
Actually, those are people would make the opposite argument.
I'm sure
That if the government owns and operates most of the land and regulates it, then we actually have less freedom. Most of the folks would argue that if it's privatized, then it's actually in the hands of, not in the hands of government, ergo, they assume it's more freedom.
and I think they're saying.
Your argument is that because of the government, see what the government does, and this is the E that Neville talks about, it's the concept of equity. This government's not efficient. So if you truly want to be more efficient with managing forest services, we hand it to a timber company that actually has a long-term vision they'll do a better job of managing it. I mean, you see this in Australia. Timber companies actually manage in the Blue Forest Nev, they actually manage sections of it. They do a really good job. But they often don't let people in too. It's their forest, which means they don't really want people there.
I would feel very less free if I wasn't allowed to take a hike in a forest. Or
They
I
do
did
this if you drive from Sydney to Canberra, right, which is a road and it's mostly desert. Nev, you ever made that drive before to Canberra? You'll see nothing but pine forests in the desert. And you go, where did all these pine forests come from? Those are artificial forests planted by timber companies, and they grow every 10 years. And so the idea is that you have fast-growing pines. I don't know the type. Neva will know this type. And then they use it for paper products for Australia. And this is a private forest grown by a private industry. And you know what they've discovered over time? That they actually attracts wildlife. They've created an ecosystem there on the road to Canberra, unintentionally, of course. So they do a better job of managing it than the government would.
They also have gun control ever, but the thing is, the problem is
It's another
people
subject.
hand it over. Right. It's a very different subject.
All right. So one of the ways you can say,
Just like the teak plantation in Costa Rica. Dino, are you going to change the slide? Because
go ahead, go for it.
under number 3, bullet number 3, would another monetary measure be the cap and trade?
Yes.
Because I really would like you
Yes.
to explain cap and trade to these folks. 'Cause
Sure.
It's so important that they understand that. Because that's a very common new way of managing. Then
Right.
the last one would be under number 3, get rid of the commons or restrict the commons. Wouldn't declaring a wilderness where it's got much restricted use, it's not multiple use anymore, wouldn't that be declaring a wilderness? Would it, I'm asking, would it fall under number 5?
Command and control.
Command and control, okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Command and control. Standard and enforcement.
Okay.
It's a wilderness area, and we restrict what happens in that wilderness area. It's commanding it and controlling it.
Okay, all right, got you. Okay.
You often hear the phrase command and control with communism, like a command and control economy,
Yeah.
where they command the economy, control production.
Right.
Conceptually, it's actually the same.
Yeah.
They command ownership over the national wilderness area, and they control what happens in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those are the regulations at play.
Yeah.
Yep. So, command and control's different. In regards to, you were saying cap and trade. Has any of you guys heard cap and trade before? What do you know about cap and trade? What do you know about cap and trade?
Okay, so then like each business will have a certain amount that they're allotted, that they can emit in pollution, and they can either use all of that or sell it to other people.
Very similar. So what they do, yeah. Let's say you produce, you're allowed, a unit of pollution is worth X, okay? And you're allowed to produce up to 50 units of pollution, however they want to measure that pollution. It varies by industry, okay? You have 50 units of pollution, you're capped. Let's say you were an industry that produced 100 units of pollution. And I have a graph that I don't have uploaded that kind of shows this. I have an interactive graphic that shows how cap and trade works, so forgive me that I don't have it up. But if you are a company that produces 100 units of pollution, how are you going to get down to 50 units of pollution? It might be very difficult.
Can you make deals with?
So you get another company that only produces 10 units of pollution. So what do you think they do with those 40 units of pollution?
Sell them to these.
They sell it to the company that makes 100 units of pollution, which means now that company can still what?
Well,
Produce 90 units of pollution.
Is it sold for one fee, or is it like leased, more or less?
You know, it varies by market. There's actually markets that are developed, commodity markets that are developed based out of Chicago that actually deal with this. You can also sell in futures as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, potential flaw in the cap and trade system. If your overall goal is to reduce pollution, what's a potential flaw in the system?
A big business that produces a lot of pollution can simply just buy up its cap, just raise its cap artificially.
The assumption is that a lot of industry participants pollute the same, and they don't. So what you essentially do is just reward those who produce for less pollution anyways, and you still allow those who produce a lot of pollution to do so anyways. They just have to pay more to do it now. Do you think they'll pay more, or they'll try to reduce pollution? They'll probably pay more. It's probably less expensive than trying to actually reduce pollution. I took a class in 2005 at UC Irvine under Bernie Grofman. We actually went through the calculations together and calculated of these 5 systems, which one is the most effective. The most effective at reducing pollution. You can probably guess which one was the most effective. This one. Command it, control it. If you go over it, we fine the living hell out of you. $1 million per incident for every water thing. All of a sudden, Logan Olds is scared crapless, right? Logan's a great guy, love him to death, but he's scared to death for his job if he's being fined $1 million per incident. That is the most effective way. It's also the most controversial way. Why is that?
Not fair.
In America, too much government.
It's essentially government control. Does that make sense? Government's telling you what you can and cannot do with your water waste.
So where does taxes on it?
Second. Taxes are second. Yep. Taxes are second. And if you want to include cap and trade in here, right? Your taxes are more effective than cap and trade. But then cap and trade's probably more effective. What do you probably is the least effective? Yeah. And actually, to be honest with you, if you were to remove government altogether, getting rid of the commons is actually one of the more effective ways to do it. But at what cost? You don't have access to it.
Right.
Yeah, you don't have access to it. So you limit public access to it by making it private, all of a sudden what happens? I'll give you an example. Do you think wealthier people do a better job of taking care of the beach?
No.
The answer is yes. Why would wealthier people do a better job of taking care of the beach?
Because
They live right there, and the whole reason why their property is worth $20 million in Malibu is because of, do you know in Malibu they've been trying for the darndest time to put up signs saying don't park here, no access to the beach. And Jerry Brown just signed into law the other day measures saying they're going to fine people for doing so. Why do you think these wealthy people are saying we don't want you on our beach? Because they don't want you on their beach. Of course, Neville, is it their beach? No, it's owned by California, right? But let's be honest about this. Who would do a better job of managing that beach, you think? If that beach right in front of that wealthy house? The wealthy person. Why?
Theirs, the property guys.
It's in their interest and they can afford to. But what have you just done by privatizing this common resource? You don't have access to that beach anymore. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
But ultimately, if you want to protect that beach and keep it pristine, that wealthy family will do a better job than you and I will any day of the week. Do you see what we'll go there and use it, and what we'll do? Leave. They're going to stay there and manage it and keep it pristine because it ups their property value. That's what we're talking about. Do you see this? Get rid of the commons. It's not a very popular decision, though. Why?
Well, could you even do that with a beach? I mean, obviously,
Sure you could.
Yeah.
People in Florida have been arguing that.
Private beaches.
There's private beaches in places like Florida.
Putting a power plant on the Celia is going to take away our commons.
It could, definitely.
It'll take away a lot of our common rights.
Do you define scenic view as a commons? If the answer is yes, then yeah. Depends on how you want to define commons.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Can a scenic view be determined as a commons? The answer is yes, actually it can. And in law, it can be held up. In fact, New York now has developed the new commons, unheard of in other places, and that's the concept of airspace. So what literally happens is a big building, if two buildings next to each other in New York City, in Manhattan, right? Let's say lower Manhattan, and one is 15 stories, the other one is 16 stories, then they knock down the 16 stories and put up a 100-story building, you are now actually crowding the airspace. You can't actually get sunlight or wind or anything, and now you have to pay that 15-story building owner cost for airspace.
Wow.
No, you don't have that concept here in California because why would you? Does that make sense? But in the city of New York, where land is at a premium, you are now blocking that person's view.
Yeah, I noticed that, like, going through New York, it's like, you find like little pockets of sunlight.
Yeah, you pay. That pocket of sunlight costs. Literally, it costs millions of dollars. It's called airspace. So that's a commons. Fits for New York. Does that make any sense here in Apple Valley? No, of course not, right? But do you see what I'm saying? So commons varies from place to place.
Yeah.
Very much so. All right, now, one way you can get rid of the commons also is the concept of a nuisance doctrine. It's related. The nuisance doctrine holds that when activities of one individual causes harm or damage to another, then you might have a cause for action to get rid of the commons. Do you see what I'm saying? That person's activities are harming us so much that we need to get rid of the commons, not have everyone to have access to it. All right, is this so far so good?
Yeah.
We're learning a lot?
Yeah.
Hopefully this will start putting things in perspective. Now, one of the things that we're going to talk about here are very quickly, the fundamentals of environmental law. Because a lot of what they're talking about is law. The legal foundation for the environmental and other types of federal law is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause. The Supreme Court ruled that the United States the federal government has the right to regulate the environment because it finds its power under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause. That the Commerce Clause reads, the Congress has the right to regulate commerce between states. Can one easily understand how the environment is between states? Easily. So very easy argument to make by the Supreme Court that environment can be regulated, can be managed by the government because it falls under the power of the Commerce Clause. So if anybody says, oh, the government doesn't have the right to do this, the answer is actually yes, the government does. Supreme Court has ruled as such. Yes, they can. Yeah, they can actually. Government does have the right to regulate. In fact, government's sole job is to regulate. That's their job. Otherwise, why would a government be needed if we didn't have regulation? Inherently, some people don't like that concept, but that's just the reality. Going back to my American government classes, if James Madison, who helped write the Constitution, said if all men were angels, no, the government would be necessary. But unfortunately, what? They're not. George Washington said it best as the first president of the United States, government is not eloquence, government is not reason, government is force. In other words, government's not here to be reasonable or eloquent. Government here is to enforce what you guys want as laws. That's government's job. That's it. It's not meant to be like poetic. It's blunt. Government is blunt. You see what I'm saying? That's why sometimes it doesn't always feel good. When the government comes after you for something, it doesn't feel good because they're using force to make you do something that you don't want to do. And you can often very much disagree, and we'll talk about later on in this presentation the recourse, or the actual how you can actually fight back against the government or fight back against interests that you don't like. You can actually take the law. You can take legal recourse is what it's called. Oops, excuse me. Stuck it over my laptop. Environmental law then is primarily concerned with the allocation of resources. Essentially, environmental law boils down to two actions: preventing the dispersal of pollution into the national environment, and preventing the damage and depletion of natural resources, or a limit on distributions that is required. So what are the two things environmental law are concerned about? Dispersal of pollution, right, into the national environment, and preventing the damage and depletion of natural resources. So in order to do both, you essentially have to have a limit on the distribution of resources. Now the American justice system, here's a problem with this though. Because the American justice system is based primarily on the idea of private property preeminence. In other words, traditionally, our dominant social paradigm from chapter 2 in this book is that the concept of private property preeminence is that it provides the property owner with the right to pollute his or her land as much as he or she wants, as long as the pollution does not carry over onto another private property. Do you see, that's the actual concept of private property preeminence. That you can pollute on your land as long as your pollution doesn't land on somebody else's. That's right. Once it lands on somebody else's, then what?
Falls under the nuisance doctrine.
Now it falls under the nuisance doctrine, correct?
Does that include affect the neighbor, like the smell of?
That's a great question. The answer is yes, it does. Yes, it does. It'll be up to the courts to define what pollution is. And in fact, remember, our courts are a passive system, which means the courts don't actively try and say this is what pollution is defined as. You, as a homeowner, sue Kyle. Because you say that the odor from his horse manure is causing a nuisance, right? And then you sue, and then the courts decide. And then the courts say, well, what's your first name?
Mike.
Mike, under the land ordinances of Apple Valley, this is actually allowed, and you knew this coming in. You signed when you bought your home saying that there's a land ordinance that said you have to sign. It said that these little things saying you live in a rural area. That's a little checkbox. Do you live in a rural area? Yes. Are you subject to this? Yes. So it'll say, well, you know what? You knew this coming in. Therefore, if Kyle wants his horses to shit on his property, you knew this coming in. You see what I'm saying? That's what the courts do. That's their job. Of course, would we have that in a place, let's say, like suburban Riverside? Yeah, in fact, that's why my neighbor across the street in San Marcos, really, really nice guy, but he was raising chickens. And I don't have a problem with raising chickens, but the smell. Woo! Chicken smell. And it was a suburban area in San Marcos.
Smell. What are you talking about?
What's that?
Beautiful smell.
If you're not used to it. No, I didn't turn him in, but my neighbor next door turned him in. And he said, absolutely not. He's a landscape engineer, and he said, absolutely not is this guy going to be raising chickens in our neighborhood. Not going to happen. Chickens bring flies, chickens this, chicken poop. He was like, not going to happen. And so he told him, you don't get rid of these chickens, I'm going to call code enforcement on you. But that's because in that part of San Marcos, we've decided that we don't want livestock, right, or other animals. I mean, this is part of it, okay? So, going back to this, so think about this. In resource use situations, private property allows individuals to kind of use whatever resources are on the land to whatever extent desired. Hence, the owner of the land may pump water from the land regardless of the impact such pumping may have on adjacent waterways. This is the inherent problem that we have in America in regards to regulating natural resources and to regulating the environment. It involves a common approach, yet private property rights say that we can do whatever we want on our land as long as it doesn't affect the person. Of course, you have to establish that it affects that person. So if you're pumping the water and it affects the waterway 100 miles downstream, that's difficult to what? Yeah, you see what I'm saying? It's very difficult. So this is something you got to keep in the back of your mind, is this constant tension between the common approach to solving environmental problems and private property preeminence. The private property is enshrined. It is a fundamental part of what it means to be an American, to have the right to do what you want with your property. I'm going to give you a really bad example, and I don't want to have a conversation on it. But back in, well, there we go. I'm not going to do it.
Go ahead, we'll shut up.
Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1957. Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, ruled that a slave was his property, and that the U.S. Constitution was founded with the idea that you cannot take away a person's property. Dred Scott, as a slave, and his master's family had moved into Illinois. Illinois was a free state, therefore Dred Scott said, I'm a free man, I'm no longer a slave. They said, no, you're a slave. Brought him back in. Dred Scott sued his master, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Taney said property rights are inviolate. You can actually do whatever you want with your property, and slaves are property. Of course, we had to amend the Constitution to say what? Slavery is abolished. In no way can a person be considered property, right? So we limited the concept of property to not belonging to humans. But this concept of property, and you have the right to do with your property, is a thoroughly American thing. I mean, it is what it means to be an American. American, right? And so Americans don't like being told to do with their properties. They really dislike it. I mean, you tell an American this is what you do with their property, boy, that's want to start a fight. That's the first thing you do. They don't have a very common approach to, I mean, even folks in New York, liberal in New York, when it comes to their apartments, they're what? I'll do what I want in my apartment. They're very, very particular about this. Americans are very particular. They're not willing to give up that power or that right to private property preeminence. It's part of what it means to be an American. And of course, you obviously see the simple problem with this. It's a problem with this if you're trying to enact environmental policy.
It's gonna infringe on people.
It's going to have to infringe on people's private property rights. And how angry do you think Americans are then? Why do you think we're not as environmentally advanced as other countries? Why do you think German engineers, like the one they're bringing over, are going to be extremely... Who said they're bringing a German engineer over to try and pioneer new things? Somebody said it? Kate, yeah, well, good luck with that. Why do you think that German guy's going to be extremely frustrated?
We're not willing to work with them.
Yeah, the engineering and technology's there. It's just that we refuse to have a common approach like the Germans do, or the French do, or the Russians don't, but, you know.
So this is the rub right here.
This is it.
This is why we
Yep.
we are so backward with sustainable.
We're not backwards. It's just a different way of living. But when it,
I think we're backwards.
fair enough, people would say you're not an American then. I mean, this is a very serious conversation. No, but very serious. And I mean that with all love, right?
No, I know.
But you see what I'm saying? It's a very serious conversation. People also say, whoa, what kind of society are you trying to push on us?
You know?
You see what I'm saying? He said earlier, well, Dino, last week it sounded like you were saying Marxist stuff. Remember?
Yeah, just a bit.
Well, what do you think when you start saying environmental protection over your property rights? What do people start saying? They start sounding like you're a communist, right? We understand that there's a common sense approach. Example, how many of you have grass on your property up here in the desert? How many of you have grass? Mike, you have grass? Do you understand how expensive water is up here?
I built a yard just for it.
Okay, so we are going to pass a law up here telling you you're going to uproot your lawn to save water because it's the #1 way to waste water is on a lawn, or we're going to fine you. How do you feel about that, Mike? Would you call me a goddamn commie bastard?
Don't tell me, you know.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Mike wants to say the right thing right now, which is what? Oh, I understand, right? But ultimately, how do you feel, Mike? And it's okay. Pisses you off, right?
Yeah.
As it should. You see what I'm saying? As it should.
And I've always known it was irresponsible. It's just a small patch.
much.
But it's so pretty.
Oh, I
We
get
still
up
love
and I
it, Mike.
mow
We're
it
not.
for 5 minutes.
We're just, we're not putting you on the spot for anything, but other than
Oh,
show how this
I
process
get it.
works. Do you see what I'm saying?
Man,
I don't
Mike,
like being
I
told what
knew
to
you
do.
didn't fit into this
But
box.
people have went about it in the right way to like offer people incentives to
Yes,
do that.
yes.
But I mean, good.
In other words, we
plans
still
like that.
keep private property preeminence, but then what we do is we encourage you through incentives. That's probably the more effective way with
Yeah,
Americans than it is to what?
Tell you.
But again, even though Mike has the incentive, cash for grass, ultimately whose decision is it?
Yes,
And what if he chooses not to?
then that's up to him.
But ultimately,
That's not
what
environmentally
happens?
friendly for us.
Yeah, what
Oh, right,
happens?
I end up using more water.
What happens through self-regulation? Yeah, what happens? You see what I'm saying? Yeah, it doesn't work, does it? Ultimately, it doesn't work. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It really doesn't. So ultimately, what we're going to do, Mike, so you're going to start passing laws telling you you're going to have to get rid of your lawn. That's what
Yeah, I know.
eventually you're going to see happening up here in the desert. I can bet money on that. I'm going to tell you that right now, because if not enough people do this cash for grass, I mean, grass is the number one way that that's where the water goes. And we don't have a lot of water up here.
What
So-
they would do is, it's a drought measure. They just say, well, you can only
Yep.
water once a week and your grass dries anyway.
Yep. And, Neville, that's called?
Command and control.
There you go. Yeah, it's a command and control at that point. You see what I'm saying? And people don't like that.
Now that really
Nobody
makes
likes
sense.
that. Nobody likes that feeling.
Las Vegas. They have, I don't know how they enforce it, I don't know.
They have
but-
water police.
They have water police?
Yeah.
Because I know you're not allowed to have a lawn.
They'll go around, they
Yep.
monitor the neighborhoods.
So
Command and control.
that's
command and
now
control.
They get fined if they have grass?
They will fine you.
If
They
you're
will,
watering at the wrong time of day.
if you're washing your car at the wrong time of day, they will fine you.
On it.
They're on you like fleas on a dog. They're all over you.
Yeah.
Okay, so they've got these program called Cash for Grass or whatever it is, right? Where does this money come from that funds this?
My paycheck.
Because-
It could come from a grant. I don't know.
Comes from
I'm gonna guess.
Comes from a public bond. That's exactly.
Okay, I was thinking public bond, or it could be a grant from the federal government.
They voted it and
Yeah.
it comes from your taxes.
Yep, it could come from various different religions. I don't know where the money comes from.
And is it hard to set up something like that? Because I mean,
No.
if we set up things like that, we could solve a lot of the problems.
Well, Hesperia has it set up. It seems to
Yeah.
be pretty effective.
Yeah.
Hesperia, the city of Hesperia has been saying that it's been pretty effective, that over 200 homes have decided to, but 200 and how many homes are up here? There's what, 90,000 people in Hesperia? I don't know. Is 200 homes enough? I
It's
don't
been
know.
massively,
What's that?
it's been massively effective.
Yeah, it's worked. It's worked. But is it enough? I don't have an answer for that. Neville might know more than I would if it's enough to mitigate water use. I don't know. Tim?
Just interesting, you said that you think there'll be laws in the near future. about
Probably, yeah, as soon as we
grass.
hit 5, because we are supposed to add, according to the Mojave Water Agency, about 100,000 more people. Once we get past adding 100,000 more people, the Mojave Water Agency last year was saying that we're pretty much at our limit. And then more drastic, when they say more drastic measures will need to take place, that's what they mean.
Yep.
Drastic measure means no more lawn for Mike, no more watering your plants in the daytime, no more washing your car, at certain times. North Carolina did this last year when they had a major drought. They said if you wash your car, we're going to fine you $500.
I guess I have two questions. I think the Spring Valley Lake Homeowners Association actually currently requires lawn.
Do they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They used to. They
Yeah.
used
So-
If it
so
hasn't
if-
been changed recently, I know they.
So if
used to
Victorville
require-
passes a law, will it trump the Spring Valley housing?
CC9.
The answer is yes, it will.
Okay.
Yes, it will. By
And
far.
Will this be enforced similar to the you can't use your fireplace law?
Probably.
Which means nobody's really going to enforce it.
Not necessarily. It depends. I mean, it's iffy. It's iffy history at this point. Hard to answer because
Depends on how bad the draft is.
depends on how bad the drought is. Depends on how many people move up here. I mean, Mojave Water Agency had expected 50,000 more people by 2014, and with the Great Recession, people didn't move up here.
Right.
So who knows? Hard to predict. Very difficult to predict. I can predict that if we do have, let's say, a couple 100,000 more people move up here and our water resources are strained, then I do think that they're going to move to more drastic measures. What do those drastic measures consist of? Laws of command and control. The most effective way you can do it, also the most controversial way because it irritates people, is it treads on your private property rights. Absolutely. You guys see this? Okay, good.
wouldn't it make so much more logical sense to charge a fee incrementally for the amount of water you use? Because I mean, as disgusting as it might sound, I can say
We already do that.
we already do that. Okay.
Absolutely.
But I mean, can I say that might be a little bit silly? Can I say that I'm not going to take any more showers, but I want this lawn?
You absolutely are charged way more base for electricity, water, natural gas. What other resource are you charged more? There's actually usage rates. And when you fall into a higher usage rate, you're charged more.
Tiers.
Electricity, thank you. Tiers, yes, thank you. They're called tiers. That happens for all resources here.
And that works
Already
well, too.
occurs.
That works well.
Works really well, except for those who care less.
But I mean, there's stipulations. What if I were to install a gray water system in my home?
Yeah.
My lawn that way.
Yeah.
I still can't have a lawn?
No, I mean, think of it this way. If everyone did that, would that reduce water usage?
Of course.
Yes. But still, you're doing what? Using water. Does that make sense? And especially up here in the desert where we recycle that water. That water that comes from wastewater goes back into the what?
Goes back into
Mojave River. And then what is the potential unintended consequences of using gray water for your lawn? Depending on how close you live to the Mojave River. You see what I'm saying? It depends on how close you live to the Mojave River. Is that going to have an effect? Right? Is it going to affect the water table? I don't know. There might be unintended consequences. There may not be. Does that make sense? This is what environmental scientists study. This is their job.
You have a lawn, you water it, you shower it. Like most people shower every day. The water's getting used anyway.
Sure.
At least this way, it's getting used.
Sure.
It's all going to the same place.
These are the discussions that Mojave Water Agency officials have. That's the discussions that they have. What would best serve the public?
But Mike, in the building code, this kind of thing would be covered most likely covered in the county or city building code. They do regulate something. So if it came to a gray water versus thing, then they would have a thing where you can have a lawn, but it has to be watered with gray water, for example. Just like they're gonna have with new developers pretty soon, you can't build a house unless 30% of your energy, electricity, comes from renewable energy that you put on your own house. That's gonna be required. So you see that stuff is built into the code. So they're not gonna tell you, if it's a viable, sustainable option, it's gonna get built in there.
That's
Right.
command and control.
Right.
That's command and control. That's what people say, well, I used to do whatever I want. Now we've gone down the road and I don't like this road. That's what they say. It's command and control. No, I'm very honest.
Don't take kindly.
It's funny, right? But I'm very honest about this. All right. So how do we solve some of these problems? We solve it through our court system. But our legal system is based on the principle of adversarial justice. Adversarial justice. What this means is that two parties are involved in a legal dispute, and they have their own supporting information to the court rather than the court conducting its investigation. This is different than what they do in Europe. So if Mike has a problem with cash for grass, or Mike has a problem with the city ordinance that says you got to rip up your lawn in the future, Mike sues the city of, where do you live, Hesperia?
Phelan.
There's no city in Phelan, so he'd sue like
San
San
Bernardino.
Bernardino County. So he would sue the county of San Bernardino. Then what happens is Mike does his research, county of San Bernardino does their research, and then they present in court. The courts don't actually do their own investigations. That's not what happens in Europe. So in Europe, if there's some kind of environmental issue, the courts can actually take action, especially in France and in Germany. The courts are active, not passive. They can actually launch a trial even without a plaintiff and a defendant. And they can do this. They're very powerful. Judges are very powerful. But judges cannot interpret constitutions over there. Judges can only interpret within the laws that are passed. So our judges are actually more powerful because when you bring a case to them, they adjudicate based on their interpretation of our Constitution. Whereas in France, they can't judge what the Constitution means in France. Only lawmakers can. What judges can do is launch investigations to see if people are actually doing what the law says. So the court system is very different. Very, very different in other parts. That's why they're more effective with their environmental policy regulations. Because if the French Parliament passes a law saying no more pollution X, then the courts can do what? They can investigate, yeah, and they can bring suit. They can file the actual magistrates can file suit. It's a very different system.
Did we call this adversarial justice?
In the U.S., we have what's called adversarial justice. We have adversaries. We have two opposing sides. We have a plaintiff and a defendant. You don't actually have to have a plaintiff or a defendant in most European courts. In England, you do. Because England has a common law system, not a civil law system. So in England, it's very similar to the US, where you have an adversarial justice system taking place. In this adversarial justice system, environmental litigation often, though, the problem with environmental litigation, or when we sue for environmental reasons, Mike, is it often involves more than two parties. But our legal system is ill-equipped to address the intricacies of environmental protection questions. When we're suing for X reason, or we're suing to stop a company from doing this, if we're suing to stop the solar power company from Spain, right, it's not just Neville suing, is it? It's this people suing, those people suing. What happens then? It becomes complicated. But our system is not designed like that. Our system is designed to say Neville Slade versus Solera. Literally, that's what it'll say on the docket, on the court docket. Slade, comma, Neville versus Solera. That's what it'll say. It's not designed to be Slade, Neville, plus this, plus this, plus this, plus this, plus this, versus these. So that's why you'll see multiple lawsuits. So you'll see Slade, and then you'll see, last name?
Brooks.
Brooks. Then you'll see... You guys related? No. What's that? Phoenix?
Felix.
Felix. Do you guys see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Brooks versus, and then what the courts will do is they'll actually then look at what the best case, right? The most right case, is what they call it. Or what will happen is a law firm can file on behalf of all these folks, and it's called the class action lawsuit.
Right.
Right. But then it's the law firm that's suing. Right? So we're not very equipped to handle these kind of things. It's very complicated. That's why environmental law is very complicated. If you want to make money, go to environmental law. There's a lot of money there. No, I'm dead serious. There's quite a bit of money there. Quite a bit of money there. All right? So now let's talk about this. Environmental laws are created by Congress. It is Congress's duty to pass laws. The next mechanism then involves the power of the executive, because the executive or the president is there to execute the laws through the formulation and implementation of regulations. This is actually a big beef that's happening right now, literally right now as we speak, between Congress and the president.
Yep.
And it has nothing to do with the environment, it has to do with immigration. I'm going to give you very brief, and I don't want to get into a conversation on it because this is an environmental policy class. But ultimately what's happening is President Obama says, I'm going to implement the policies that I see fit underneath the law passed by Congress. And John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, is saying these policies do not fit under the law as we see it passed by Congress. So there's a big debate right now. And so Boehner says if you continue to give executive orders on immigration, implementing policy the way we don't think it fits under the law, we'll sue you. So Boehner's actually thinking about filing suit, and it'll be John Boehner versus Barack Obama in the legal system. That's what's going to happen.
Would that be a first?
No, not at all.
No? It's
Not at all.
before.
Of course, because there's always a tug and pull. Always. Between the president and Congress. Always. It's been like that since the
Yeah, but
beginning.
I just never knew they really actually sued.
Sure.
Yeah?
Sure. And then it'll be up to the courts to decide whether or not John Boehner has what we call standing. Standing is whether or not he has the right to sue. The Supreme Court may say, no, actually, you, John Boehner, you may not have the right to sue. Because to be fair, the president does have the power to execute. And he can decide how he wants to execute the law. Congress passes a law, but Congress doesn't execute the law. So if Congress wants President Obama to do something, they need to clarify, which means they need to what? Depends on the law. If the immigration law is very vague, then President Obama has a lot of room to execute. But and this is the problem with the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act was very vague when Congress passed it. So presidents were interpreting it as they see fit. So finally it got to the courts, and the courts ruled that endangered species doesn't mean just a species that is ready to die off, but it could potentially include all species, including our own. So they gave a very broad interpretation of what endangered species is and government protection of endangered species, because presidents were executing it as they saw fit. Nixon instituted it one way, Carter instituted another way, and Reagan went a completely different way with it. So this is why sometimes you're like, how the hell is it that the law didn't change? Actually what happened is the president changed, and the way they implement the law changes. And they have the right to do that. Presidents have the right. That's why they're called the executive branch. The president executes the law into action. And it's not always the way Congress intends it to be. If Congress doesn't like it, then they can always change the law and force the president to do what he wants. Which they do. They do all the time. Congress changes laws and then tells the president, stand down. Because the best way you can actually put the president in his place is to cut the funding. Congress has what we call the power of the purse. So if you want to keep the president in check, cut the funding that he has to certain things, and then he has no choice but to do what you ask him to do. This is why politics is a dirty business. Dirty, dirty business. Very dirty.
So to try to simplify it,
It is, yeah. But welcome to politics.
the command enforce thing, right? Is the law the command and the enforce the policy?
Yes, the law is the command, and the executive is the control.
Okay.
That's why it's called the command and control. Yes.
And they do it through policy.
Yes.
Now, often when you write good law, though, you should write it with policy.
When you write a good law, you give direction to people who implement policy.
Okay. You give
Yes.
directions, not
Or-
the policy itself.
Or what you can do, Congress does do this, Congress gives what we call level statutory authority to an agency to make policy as they see fit.
Right.
So for example, the Federal Reserve Board, which is our country's central bank, has chartered by Congress, and in their charter it says that the Federal Reserve Board has autonomy to make decisions about the money supply regardless of what Congress or the President thinks. Congress gave these Board of Economists autonomy over the money supply. Why did they want to give these economists autonomy or freedom over this money supply? Because they didn't trust politicians. Give it to the economists who are what we call technocrats. These economists are the people with PhDs in economics who know a lot about money, so let them run it rather than having...
That's where this nonsense, what I thought was nonsense when they say the Federal Reserve System is privatized.
It is not privatized at all.
But people think that. Some people think
I don't know where they think that, but no way. It's a government entity. It's chartered by Congress.
But because private people make decisions.
No. The Reserve Board members are not private people at all. They're public officials. They're nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and a Federal Reserve Board member serves 14 years. Yeah, no, they are not private at all. They come from private industry. So what these folks are doing is saying cynically that the Federal Reserve Board serves the interests of the banks, not the people.
Maybe that's what it is.
That's what it is. They come from the banking industry. This actually happens a lot. Let me give you an example. This happens a lot with the Department of Interior. That the Secretary of the Interior often comes from a ranching state or a cattle grazing state like Montana or Colorado. Why? Because then the Department of Interior serves the interests of the cattle industry or the grain, you know what I mean? Or these industries. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, so this is the other side of the coin is who the President appoints and who the Senate confirms. All right. The third mechanism then, if the first mechanism is creating the laws, second mechanism is executing the laws, the third mechanism then is oversight of this regulatory process. This is to ensure that the executive is carrying out the legislative mandate in proper accordance with the relevant statute. So it's not enough that we also check to see if the executive is doing his right job. And I say he right now because there's never been a female president. He, right? The foundations then of environmental law and regulation require the presence of three basic mechanisms then. And here's Neville, if you want to have an effective environmental policy, these are the three mechanisms that you need. First is establish legislative policies and directives. In other words, you need a law, as Neville said, that is what? That's really what? Detailed, right? And that tells you exactly sort of what we mean by this law. So some kind of established legislative, some kind of law and directives within the law to tell you what you should do. The second mechanism is prescribed methods for executing these policies and directives. So if the directive is to reduce water use, that's the directive, then there has to be some policy that's developed to execute this directive. Do you guys see this? And this policy is then usually devised by the agency tasked with enforcing it. Congress doesn't have the time to sit there and enforce every little thing. Does that make sense? So they task it to the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act says that Americans should have access to clean water. Our directive is that water shall be clean. Whose job is then to enforce this and devise policy to execute this? The Environmental Protection Agency. Then they're the ones who want to fine folks $1 million a pop, $1 million an incident. Do you see what I'm saying? Finally, there has to be some kind of prescribed method for resolving disputes that arise from the execution of policies and directives. What happens if the legislative policies conflict with the executive, the legislative directives conflict with how they execute policy? then there's got to be a way of resolving it. And the courts are where you resolve it, generally speaking. The court system is how it's resolved. So far, so good? Now, of greatest concern to environmental policy, guys, are the last two mechanisms. The formulation and implementation of regulations is actually primarily governed by the Administrative Procedures Act. The Administrative Procedures Act allows the executive branch to develop what's known as administrative law. The executive branch, the president actually appoints 3,000 people to various positions, from directors of agencies to cabinet secretaries to chairmen of boards, that they all work to do something for the government in various capacities. You have the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, right? The Environmental Protection Agency, the Justice Department, the National Labor Relations Board. You notice they all do what? They devise, implement, and execute policy in various different areas. And the Administrative Procedures Act allows these different agencies to do so. So the laws that pertain to and govern administrative and bureaucratic government actions are referred to as administrative law. The process that resolves the regulatory disputes of executive agencies is referred to as judicial review. Courts review actions taken by federal agencies. And those courts review once they're brought to a party, once they're brought to a suit, by a party. In other words, somebody has to sue. Somebody has to sue. That's how our system works. When people say, oh, we're a litigious society, we sue so much. I was talking with a gentleman there from BLM. He says, we sue. And I was going to tell him, actually, that's what we're supposed to do. If we don't like what we see, what do? Why would we prefer suing? What's often the alternative in other countries?
Government is telling you what to do.
Violence. What happens if you can't get your government to change? People often resort to, very quickly they resort to violence. The violence comes quick in societies where they don't have rule of law. So, but you know that you have remedy, or the idea to solve a problem, or you have recourse, that you get something back, something that you lost, you get it back. You know what I mean? It could be a penalty, a fine. You have the right to recourse or to remedy. And procedures are set up for this. And the courts are set up for this primary reason. Is it quick? Nope. Is it long? Yes. Is it costly? Yes. But justice is never done quickly. Honestly. It takes a long time. But we prefer this method over the alternative methods that exist in other parts of the world. Just being very honest with you. You know? Let's talk about where Nev's from. Poor South Africa. South African blacks, did they have the process of judicial review? Could they go to the courts to try and overturn apartheid laws? So what did they resort to? What did Mandela? We often praise Mandela as a figure of peace, which is true. But at the beginning of his career, what did he do? What did he say? He incited violence, right? And he would also raise, his machine gun salute, right? And by any means necessary, he would quote Malcolm X.
Actions blew up a lot of government buildings and probably killed at least 2 people.
Yep. And that's why he was imprisoned on Robben Island.
Yep.
For the 27 years.
Right.
For those actions. Now, you could say that he was doing those actions for the right cause, right? But that's what happens when you don't have the ability of the courts to review what the government does. When the courts there, the white court said, nope, any laws passed by the white government are the laws, and the coloreds and Africans cannot challenge this in court. You have no standing in court, and that's what happens. People resort to violence. You can't blame them, but what happens in society when people resort to violence? People die. And we prefer not to see people die. It's not in our interest. This is why I kind of laugh at some of my students in my other classes. They're like, kill them all, or violence, or I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. You know what I mean? When you say stuff like that, slow down. Too many video games. You know? Yeah. Get a video game mentality, right?
Desensitized.
Kyle knows what I'm talking about. We were in our hybrid class. A couple of those guys are all talking about, they immediately want to go right to what?
Right to the guns.
Right to the gun, right to the violence. It's like, whoa, slow down, Turbo. We got a long ways to go before we get there. So, before the courts will conduct a judicial review, the plaintiff, or the person who sues, must first exhaust all administrative remedies that the court deems appropriate. This is known as the exhaustive doctrine. You cannot just sue, you got to try and fix it before you can sue, especially when it comes to the environment. So therefore, it requires that all polluters seek every available avenue of appeal within an administrative agency before going to court. So let's say the government fines a corporation because of its pollution practices, and it says it violates a law or a policy in regards to pollution. That corporation now has to try every means possible administratively before they go to court. They just can't go to court right away. Does that make sense? You got to try and solve it before you get to court. That's called the exhaustive doctrine. So yes, remember I told you got to go to court, but the courts would prefer you try to what?
Work it out.
Work it out, and if you can't, then what? Then you go to court. Yeah, then you go to court. That's what the courts are there for. The next step then is simply judicial review, and it carries numerous limitations that define which cases the court will and will not hear. The scope of review concerns which parts of the relevant administrative actions the courts will address. Sometimes there is no way, they won't allow corporations to sue. They'll say, you know what, sorry, this is, according to this statute, this is what we have deemed is the right thing to do. Therefore, you have no scope for review in this area. In other words, you have a limited ability to actually sue under this particular law. Standards of review define the scrutiny that the court may take in examining a challenged agency action. Now, one of the most important limitations on judicial review is the concept of judicial standing. In a nutshell, judicial standing, which I've mentioned a couple times, concerns who can and cannot bring a suit before the court for judicial review. To have standing, the plaintiff has to satisfy two requirements. First, that they have to have a concrete interest in the matter, in the case. And second, that they have to show that they have immediate injury in fact. In other words, you have to have an interest in the case. You can't just say, oh, well, I sue simply because I want to. And second, you have to show immediate injury. And you have to be able to, the courts have to be able to provide a remedy. If the courts cannot find a solution, then the courts will say, we can't do anything about it, not allowed in court. Do you guys see this? So if you sue, you have to show that you have a reason to sue. You have a compelling interest, concrete interest. You can't sue simply because. So your mom or dad can sue. They can say they have a compelling interest because that, is it a wind farm, Nev, or a solar farm? Wind farm, right?
Wind farm.
That wind farm is going to be next to our house, so we don't know what the unintended consequences are. Therefore, you have a concrete right. You see that? A concrete interest. Where do you live? Yep, not going to happen. You see what I'm saying? Why the court's going to say you don't have standing? So you would have a concrete interest. Could you see yourself having immediate personal injury? What could consider immediate injury? Don't think of injury to your arm. What else?
Financial.
Financial.
Losing equity in their home.
The value of your home will drop dramatically. Therefore, can you show that you have immediate injury in fact?
Yes.
Yes, you'll lose value in your home. Then the courts have to be able to provide a solution. Is there a solution to this problem? Yes, don't build the wind plant. Do you guys see how this works?
Yeah.
So if all else fails and the folks out there can't work with this company and they can't work within the law and they can't work with administrative, then the last option is to sue. And that's what happens. And your mom and dad are plaintiff. They do have standing. Standing means that they have a concrete interest, they have an immediate injury, and they must be able to remedy. In this case, the remedy would be to not build the wind farm. Neville, does that make sense?
If you put in, like, if you're suing for saying that they would reduce the value of your home, then can you also say and lifestyle and the environment,
Right to enjoy.
and stuff like that
Yeah,
as well?
sure. The courts will decide whether or not that's injury.
Yeah.
You can say it's injury. You'll have to show them why it is. And the courts might say what? Property value is an easy one to show, right? You get an appraiser out there and they can give an estimate of what it would cost, what the house would be worth after the wind farms. Lifestyle is a little bit more what? A little bit more difficult,
But what
right?
about the
Not that it's impossible. Huh?
What about like the environment and biodiversity, like that?
It's much more difficult to prove.
Who's on that?
Let me tell you why. And I think she brought up a wonderful point that I want you to think about. She's talking about what about the injury to biodiversity? Is that an immediate injury to you?
No.
Yeah, because,
How?
She can't.
I'd like to hear this.
I guess it would be traumatic for me.
Why?
Yeah.
Because it's part of my environment, and it's part of who I am, it's part of my lifestyle here, and.
So if I was a lawyer for, what is it, who's putting in the wind farm?
I think they call it Eon.
If I'm a lawyer for Eon, how could I counter against what she just said? How could I easily do this? Is truly biodiversity part of your personal environment?
Well, it
Could you easily make a case against that?
I think you could.
Easily.
You could,
Sure.
but what about the global welfare and for?
Even a harder case to make.
Yeah, you-
Why is that an even a harder case to make? And I'm going to give you, no, I'm glad she brought that up because I'm going to show you 2 court cases that we've actually dealt with that. Sierra Club versus Morton, right? And then we'll talk about Friends of the Earth versus a waste management company. 2 court cases that I have up here that'll deal directly with what she's saying.
You have to actually come up, I mean, but certainly the harming of biodiversity can affect your life, but you have to actually come up with how it affects your life.
Yeah, you have to quantify.
You're gonna have to quantify it, you're gonna have to come up with something specific, and you can, I mean, it's such a vague thing, you can find something
Well, what
to
about
how
the
it affects you.
And it's just as easy for the defendant to do what?
To counter.
If it's vague, then it's easy for the defendant to do what?
To argue against it.
Yeah, very, yeah. And courts tend to go, careful with those arguments. The courts tend to say careful with those. Because you know what? We don't tolerate, because then anything could be what? Personal injury, right? The courts are very careful
Sure.
because then once you open that Pandora's box, then what happens? Oh, President Bush sent my son off to war. He died, therefore it's my what?
If you,
Do you see what I'm saying? They're very careful with these things. They're very careful when they allow for personal injury, and I think you can all understand why, right?
Yeah.
unless you
There's
have
been a lot of case law beforehand to determine what is considered personal injury. And often it means injury to what? What does personal mean?
Self.
Self.
or your income.
Income is considered personal. Labor is considered personal. Is the biodiversity around you considered personal?
If you make
Yeah,
an
it's
income off it
public
somehow.
lands and we all own part of
It's
it.
public lands, it's not personal now, it's a common resource. You see the difficulty?
But so then if you get enough homeowners involved,
They'll each have to show how it's a personal injury to them. Do you see what I'm saying? How hard is this?
Pretty hard.
Difficult.
It's not easy. I'll show you the cases in a couple slides. It's really, really difficult. I know where you're going with this, and I applaud you, but what am I doing here?
just showing the facts.
How hard it is, right? Why do you think environmentalists struggle so much in courts?
Yeah.
Why do you think environmentalists often fail in courts?
They can't
Because
show
they can't show personal injury. Now, I'm going to show you a case where the courts have allowed for some room, but I don't want to get there yet, okay? But I like this conversation. You can understand now why it's so difficult. Crap, I'm using up most of your guys' time. I apologize for that.
Just briefly, you can't quantify like an annoyance. Like I walk out of my house and there's these things blocking my view.
Sure you can. You can quantify very easily. You can count how many feet it is. Right?
Okay.
Yeah. It's harder to quantify biodiversity. Very simple. Can you quantify an obstruction of your view? Yeah, you can measure it. Right? How hard is it to measure biodiversity and the impact it has? I mean, they're still working on it.
Well, what if every day she goes out and she feeds the quail, and now they're ripping up this plot of land next to her. The quail's going away. Now she can't enjoy the quail because they
As
all
the
got
lawyer
sick.
for the defendant, let's assume they're Spanish. How is that a personal injury? How is that injurious to her?
That's her quiet time. She goes out there to relax. She enjoys.
Show me how that impairs her. Can she have quiet time to play? Can she go feed ducks somewhere else? I'm actually not against you, but what am I doing?
No, yeah.
You're being what she's gonna get responded to, that's how they're gonna come back at her.
Do you blame them?
Gotta go with the personal, no, you gotta go with the personal
But what
effects,
if you
like the
first-
money. You bought that property.
Money is
so you
so
can
much
feed
more
yourself.
easier to what?
Prove.
Why can't you go feed the ducks at a pond down the street somewhere else? Why do you have
Yeah.
to do it there? Yeah, it's hard to establish what? Personal injury in environmental cases does. And I think you all understand why. It makes a lot of sense why it's so difficult to establish personal injury cases in environmental lawsuits. I think it's an obvious understanding. Doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. And I'll show you a case where it did happen. But it is difficult. It is very
Okay, here's something. You have a group of old
We're running out
ladies
of
that-
time, but forgive me, Mike, go ahead, we're
Group-
running out of time.
Group of people that are all bird watchers, and you actually get together as a group. It's a big deal, and you go out and you take pictures of birds. That would have a direct impact on something like that.
Yes. Yes, it would.
Especially if you were
Yes,
charging
you
a
can
fee.
show personal injury, especially if you're charging fees for this or your livelihood depends on this. Absolutely.
So you go, we'll
Yes.
form a bird group over at your house.
And why do you think Why do you think they formed something called the Friends of Juniper Flats? Or the Friends of Cactus Flats? Ah, now we
Now I
understand
get it.
why they organize. Why do they organize?
For protection.
Get support.
There you go. There you go. The courts are much more amenable when you can show stuff like that than it is when it's individual. Sure. There you go. Now why do you think those good folks that we went on the field trip for, why do you think they organize? It's not just to deal with BLM. It's because what happens in case they have to, they can do what? They can show personal injury, yeah, in court. Absolutely, yeah. As a group, that's correct. Very interesting, right?
Oh.
Yeah.
What's that? Good. Join the group. Absolutely. All right. Now, hey, you guys were asking about this? Let me explain it to you now.
Okay.
2 court cases that deal with exactly with, what's your first name?
Rebecca?
Rebecca was talking about. 2 court cases. The first case is Sierra Club versus Morton. Right? In Sierra Club versus Morton, what you saw was that the Disney Corporation had actually bought land up in the Sierra Nevada and they wanted to develop it as a resort. So the Sierra Club sued, saying no. They contested the right of the Disney Corporation to build this resort in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And then the Supreme Court, what it did is it actually denied the plaintiffs, and I'm looking for the case in the book here, I didn't have it on the right page. It denied the plaintiffs. Why? Because the Sierra Club could not show where there was immediate injury. Their argument was that it would ruin the pristine area of the Sierra Nevadas if Disney could build a resort here. And the Supreme Court said, how was the Sierra Club personally injured by this? And so they argued, because the Sierra Club argued as a public interest group rather than as individuals. Do you guys see this? Mm-hmm. They argued as a public interest group. They said it's a public interest, like Friends of Juniper Flats. This affects us. And they said, sorry, what? That's not enough. You actually have to show us how individual and personal experience would be ruined by the development, is what they said. And they couldn't show that, because the Sierra Club would say, well, it would ruin our hiking. And the court's like, well, why can't you hike just right over the hill? Do you see what I'm saying? So this was kind of a blow to environmentalism early on. And you saw a lot of economic development in the 70s and 80s. Then in 2000, you saw something different. Friends of the Earth versus Laidlaw Environmental Services, which was decided by the Supreme Court in 2000. Now what they did is they said, hey, we re-emphasize Sierra Club versus Morton. Harm done to plaintiffs, re-emphasize that harm done to plaintiffs and not done to the environment is still important for standing. You cannot sue and say that the reason I'm suing is because you're harming the environment. You need to have personal standing. Does that make sense? Personal injury. But here's the big but. They set precedent for perception of harm as opposed to actual harm. You know what does that mean? If it could possibly harm you, then you can sue. So what the Friends of the Earth were suing was that Laidlaw Environmental Services was discharging pollutants into the river that went beyond the limits granted in the permit. And even though the pollution had not directly harmed the Friends of the Earth were given standing because they perceived the river to be polluted, and because of that they used it less frequently.
Very good.
Yeah. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it took about 30 years to get to that point where the Supreme Court said you can sue because of a potential harm, but not because of actual harm. Before it was show me literally how it harmed you personally. Can't do that? Sorry, you can't sue on behalf of the environment. Now you can say how it could potentially harm you. And so Friends of the Earth said, well, we drink from this river. Eventually what's going to happen? These pollutants will come down, therefore we need to stop these pollutants from coming in. And the Supreme Court said, we buy that. Does that open it up more for environmental lawsuits now? Oh yeah, it did. And that's why you're seeing more environmental lawsuits being filed since 2000. Is this making sense? Yeah. Good, because I really was hoping these folks would stay so they could hear this stuff so they could put it in perspective.
What about mental harm? What if someone living out there on Octio is living there because the RAL area helps their schizophrenia and not be so bad?
Does perception, that's actual harm.
That's actual harm.
Yeah, that's not perceived harm, that's actual harm. How do we know it's actual harm?
Because it's actual harm.
Yeah, you can quantify it. Yeah, you could say they go into some kind of hysteria, or they go into some kind of shock. You can quantify. The doctor can have what? Document this stuff. The EMTs can document this stuff.
So even mental harm is actual harm.
Mental harm is harm. Yeah, absolutely. Sure. You better believe it is. Sure.
Could you say that, say if they were to put solar development somewhere in the desert close to us, not close enough to be a residential area, but somewhere further out, but still close to a power line, would it be able to say that the expectation of development could be possibly ruining the economy of the local area, that could possibly very well be gaining a lot of revenue from extra purchase?
I see a career in law. Right here. So understand that I actually don't have a law degree. I have a PhD in political science. I've taken quite a few constitutional law classes, environmental law classes actually. But I cannot answer every single instance. Why? First of all, it's fictional and counterfactual, and you're putting all these conditionals that I can't really what. And second of all, I'm actually not a lawyer. So I don't have the right to represent. Everything that I give you is what comes from the books and the cases I've read. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if you say, well, how about if I do this, how about if I do that? The answer is, really, I don't know.
It's just not the same person.
I'm just here, I have to give a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. It means I can't answer these kind of legal questions. I'll be in trouble actually if I do. I cannot answer these kind of legal questions. I can give you what if scenarios, but those are only what ifs and I could be wrong. And the thing is, you'll have to understand that I'm most likely wrong because I don't know the particulars of that case. You see what I'm saying? Or a potential case or future case. Gosh, at that point, who knows, you know?
In these cases,
Last question, we gotta move on.
In these cases, who exactly is making the report? Because if you make a case that appeals, like if I said that you don't want to make this a rural area and people are living here because it's rural, and people in the border.
Rural,
Sorry. Who is delivering? Like I know it's people.
depends on where you sue.
That's what I'm wondering. Like who makes the report in like a high profile court case?
It depends. Are you suing under federal law or state law?
Federal.
Then you gotta go to a federal court. Where's the nearest federal court? Riverside. So you sue and then Judge Virginia Phillips would adjudicate. I know Judge Virginia Phillips. She's going to adjudicate. I knew her executive assistant, Ann. She was married to my best friend, Rob. So, you know, that's what she does. She adjudicates. It's her job to judge. In some cases involving monetary damages, you have to have a jury. So if it's about money, then there may be a federal jury instead of a judge that renders the decision. But in many cases, in environmental cases, you're not actually looking for monetary damages, you're looking to stop something, right? Therefore, the judge then renders a decision. Okay? In this case, it would be Virginia Phillips. If you're suing under, let's say, National Environmental Policy Act. And what a great segue, right? Because we're running out of time. I got 10 minutes and I will hurry up. Okay? Although there are many laws and agencies that govern environmental management, there are major participants in the process. The most important law is NEPA. Right, that they mentioned earlier. It's unique in that the Act actually exerted control over federal agencies themselves in an attempt to make them more responsive to environmental concerns and values. So the NEPA is implemented through the Council on Environmental Quality and the White House Office on Environmental Policy. The most important part of NEPA is an environmental impact statement. An EIS must accompany major federal actions that significantly affect the human environment. There's some key words in there that need to be interpreted. What constitutes an action? When is it major? And what constitutes a significant environmental impact, right? So really, really big words here. So let's define them. An action is a federal action if a federal agency has some control over that action, or the action is carried out by the agency itself. So it's an action if the federal agency has some control over the action, or if it's carried out by the agency itself. Second, what is major? The determination of whether or not an act is major generally involves any substantial commitment by the government or money or other resources. Let's say like the Hoover Dam. How much money do they commit? That would make it a what? Major, right? Major, right? And we know that it is an action by the federal government because the federal government paid for this. Significant environmental impact, guys, just doesn't refer to like woods and forests. Or woods and trees, or woods and streams. It involves the public in all locations, whether urban or rural or suburban. And it means that the public must, that all locations be provided, quote, safe, healthful, productive, and aesthetically and culturally pleasing surroundings. So if you were to build a jail in the middle of Newport Beach, you could actually sue. If the federal government wanted to put a jail in Newport Beach, they would have to have an environmental impact statement. And that environmental impact statement has to include not only, right, the impact to the ground, the impact to the air, the impact to traffic, but provide a safe, healthful, productive, and aesthetically and culturally pleasing surroundings.
How do you determine that?
What's that?
How do you determine that?
Beauty.
Do you want, I mean, you can make a building. I tell you what San Marcos did. They put a Sonic drive-in, and they forced the Sonic drive-in to put a fountain in and a garden. Why?
Easier on the
Yeah,
eyes.
I mean, you can do this.
What if those windmills aren't aesthetically pleasing?
Then you can.
Are they not?
Yeah, that's part of it. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Isn't that interesting that
The Dutch are kind of funny about them.
read those safe, healthful, what is it?
Let me read it for you. Sure. Safe,
Yeah.
healthful, productive, and aesthetically and culturally pleasing surroundings.
Those, it's the National Environmental Policy Act,
Correct.
which in everybody's mind
There's
points
woods and
towards
streams.
Woods and streams, birds and bees, and actually it's the human environment
Correct.
that it's talking about.
Correct. Anytime the federal
That's
agency,
a major revelation.
that's why you need an environmental impact statement anytime something is built. Notice that? Anytime the federal government builds something, there has to be an environmental impact statement. End of story. End of story. Regardless of where it's built. Even if it's built on the most polluted piece of land, New York City, doesn't matter.
Is that what those windmills have to provide as well?
If they're built by the government, or if they involve any type, or if they have policy over that area. So if it's a private company building on BLM land, therefore they have policy area control over it, which means yes, that Abengoa, or not Abengoa, Solera, and whatever Eon, that other one is, would have to provide an economic, environmental impact
This is
statement.
where these little ones in the community have got a little break. It has to reach a certain level before it comes under CEQA, which is the California equivalent.
Uh-huh.
And if it's small enough and it doesn't have this or that, they just have to do an environmental report,
Uh-huh.
not a full environmental impact
That's
statement.
correct. They don't fall under federal guidelines, right? It falls under state guidelines instead. And it,
But there's even, they don't, most of them aren't even being forced to do an EIS under CEQA.
because they're probably too small even under state
There's
guidelines.
some kind of guide, yeah.
Might be
kind of-
even too small under
Yeah.
state guidelines. For example, if you put solar panels on your roof, you don't have to produce an
Right.
environmental impact statement. Why?
Right.
Or you don't have to produce a CEQA statement, if I remember correctly.
Right.
You don't have to. See what I'm saying? It's too small.
Yeah.
It's too small. Yep, absolutely. Your turn, Ernest?
Other criteria.
No, well, that's true. Okay. So interesting, right? How this works. When they want to build federal prisons, they often pick low-income communities to build federal prisons. Why is that?
No, I don't know, no community,
The community doesn't say this is not aesthetically or culturally pleasing.
Or they don't have enough money.
Don't have a voice.
Oh no, you don't need money to sue. You can sue without money. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's just that oftentimes the people in the community don't have enough organized, or they're not interested enough to say what, that this is not a safe, friendly, healthy, yeah. This is why this is an environmental justice concern. You pack all the prisons, you pack all the sewage treatment plants, you pack all the materials reprocessing plants in poor, low-income, mostly minority neighborhoods, because those are the neighborhoods that often lack enough cohesion to effectively contest an environmental impact statement report.
Put all the utility grade renewable energy projects in the Mojave, in the high desert.
You read my mind. That's why. Now you understand. Yes. Yeah, now you guys are learning, right? Yeah, absolutely. I think everybody should be, I think everybody who takes this certificate should be required, right, to read this kind of stuff, because it directly impacts the kind of, that guy Jeff, BLM, his major was environmental policy.
Yeah.
The gentleman over here, environmental policy.
Yeah.
Why policy, guys? You can be all the biggest scientists you want in the world, but it really comes down to, your good friends from UCR can come up with all the reasonings they have, but it really comes down to what?
implementing the law.
Understanding policy, yeah. They're more effective if they understand policy rather than the data.
Yeah.
Sounds sad, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it is sad, but that's sometimes reality. All right, let's continue. There's a two-step process to determine whether or not an impact is significant. The first step is the preparation of an environmental assessment. If no significant impact is found, then the agency is required to issue a FONSI, or finding of no significant impact. Now, if you look here, it's an environmental impact statement. There's a proposed action, coordination and analysis. Is there significant impact? If the answer is no, you document appropriately and the agency takes action. They approve Solera's solar field, okay? Yes, you know there's significant impact. Then you need notice of intent and scoping process, a draft EIS, public comment, a final EIS, record of decision, and then agency action, so the public gets a chance to comment. If you're not sure, which is what a lot of these decisions fall under, if you're unknown, then you do an environmental assessment. This is where the lawyers step in, right? If it is a significant impact, then you go through this process. No significant impact to issue a FONSI, then there's agency action. So it could be that if they want to build these solar fields on disturbed land, like former agricultural land, then they could go through, do an environmental assessment, see that there's going to be finding of no significant impact, a FONSI, and then what happens? Then they can move forward with approving. The agency can move forward with approving then the solar plant on disturbed land. But you have to, if there is significant impact, then you have to do notice of intent. You got a scope, which means you got to get out there, right? Then you have a draft EIS, and the public gets to comment on it. This is another key step in the process, Neville. If you want to stop if you want to stop those windmills, when they pay attention, when it gets to the environmental assessment, read the environmental assessment. It's public. You can download it as a PDF. And then you can read what depends. I mean, this is at the federal level. I don't know if that wind farm actually constitutes underneath this.
It does, oh yeah.
Okay, wasn't sure. You know, at that point, I'm not quite sure. Neville would know then at that point. More than
That's where I was stuck, is they're doing environmental assessments on these smaller projects.
Yes.
They're basically saying on certain criteria it's not having a significant impact.
That's right. And they would issue a FONSI, and then the agency would approve that wind farm.
Right.
But if the environmental assessment comes that there could be significant impact, then what do?
Then it has to go that way.
They have to go that way.
Middle things for.
Yeah, but then they have to have some kind of draft. And what's the environmental impact? Can they mitigate it? How would they mitigate it, right?
Yeah.
That's what the environmental impact statement does. And if you want to know
There's a fail-safe in there.
the stages of the environmental impact, for those of you, the few of you that are here that are in my class, you would then just read contents of an EIS, pages 77 to pages 79, and it tells you exactly what's in an EIS, step by step. This is it.
I got to read this.
Yep.
And we should have had you give this lecture before.
Yeah, I know, when they're here. Yeah, they
But
would benefit.
for everyone. For everyone.
Yeah, they'd benefit from this.
We're going.
Well, some of them would be a rehash of what they already know
Gotta
from
remember
college
that.
classes.
Gotta remember that next time.
Okay, so environmental administration. There are many different agencies that administer environmental policy. The big one is the EPA. Primary responsibility for enforcing environmental regulations in the U.S. It was created under an executive order by President Nixon. The EPA is basically organized around programs over which Congress has given it enforcement authority. Politics of enforcement has always been an issue in the EPA. Appointment of the EPA administrator by the president is usually meant to serve the policy needs of that administration, not necessarily because they want to promote the environment. One of the primary problems within the EPA is the fragmented way in which it regulates various programs. For example, they have many different pollution abatement programs. Some of these pollution abatement programs can be consolidated to be more administratively and economically efficient. That's a big concern with the EPA. EPA has 17,571 employees, $10 billion budget. But just so you know, that budget's not big enough to complete all of its tasks appropriately. Because not only is the EPA tasked with regulating or implementing environmental policy, part of the problem is that they actually have to know what the hell they're regulating. You have to actually understand what you are going to regulate. And you cannot regulate something you don't understand. So $10 billion is not enough to do the kind of research that the EPA is often asked to do. Because research of environmental issues can be very expensive and very lengthy, guys. Much more than what's there. Now, the Department of Interior is the next major environmental administrative agency. established in 1849, and it's actually a cabinet level agency. It's really high up in regards to the totem pole. It is headed by a secretary and 5 assistant secretaries covering each of the major substantive areas within the department's jurisdiction. Traditionally, Secretary of Interiors tend to have ties to the West, and for the most part, a big conservationist themselves. They do kind of have a long institutional history and tradition. They have a well-developed interest group system. Sometimes they promote mining interests, sometimes they promote ranching interests. Most recently, Secretary of the Interior Ken Salazar was interested in protecting environmental areas of concern. Normally, I'll be very honest with you, under Republican administrations, the Secretary of Interior often promotes business interests. Under Democratic administrations, the Secretary of Interior often promotes environmental interests. Yeah, often that's what you see. Just being honest with you. Clinton was kind of the exception. He tried to do both. Just being honest with you. Under Obama, it's clearly pro-environmental, not as much interested in economic interests. Just so you understand. And the opposite was true under Bush. Under Bush, it was more about economic interest than it was about environmental. So you often do see this divide with the Republican and Democratic presidential administrations. The book that you're reading of goes through the history of each one, and it says how you can see dramatic changes from administration on how the same law is executed differently. Okay, next one, BLM. Gotta go through these quickly. Bureau of Land Management, where the gentleman was from. Created in 1946, manages 270 million acres of public land, primarily in the West and Alaska. 300 million acres where mineral rights are owned by the federal government. How do we know what was BLM land? What became BLM land? Very interesting story. After farmers secured the federal lands they wanted for farming, prime forests were then reserved in the U.S. forest system. The most spectacular pieces of land, like Yellowstone, were reserved for the national park system. Whatever was left over, the lands that no one wanted, became the responsibility of the BLM. And if Jeff was here, he'd laugh and probably confirm that. Basically, the land nobody wanted, which in essence, back then, because we were a farming nation, a lot of that is desert land.
Mountains.
And mountains, deserts leading into mountains, all the desert highlands of Utah, right? All these areas are BLM land. These are the lands nobody wanted. You couldn't farm on it, you couldn't mine on it, you couldn't do anything with it. Give it to the government, they'll take it.
Yeah.
Literally, it's not beautiful. Yellowstone is beautiful, does that make sense?
Yeah.
The sequoias are beautiful, does that make sense? The desert, not so beautiful. So let's give most of the desert to the BLM. Yes?
Can you buy property from the BLM then?
I don't think so. I think you have to actually lease it from the BLM, if I'm not mistaken. Good question. You know Jeff would know. I don't think so. They'd have to transfer from public to private ownership, and that takes...
It is all leased. The mining, if you're going to be
Yeah,
mining,
it's all leased.
you're going to lease it. Those grazing rights are a form of lease.
I have heard, and Neville will have to correct me, the BLM over time will give up areas to cities if they want to grow.
Yeah.
Like example, they might give an area up to Hesperia, or give an area up to a sphere of influence to Apple Valley or something like that. But I don't think that's common. They essentially take care of lands that really nobody wants to live on, out in the middle of nowhere.
Are you allowed to hike through there and camp whenever you want, pretty much?
BLM lands tend to be pretty open. I mean, there are regulations. For example, they have certain off-highway vehicle areas, OHV areas. They don't want you just riding your dirt bike anywhere in the desert. There's certain areas where they allow you to ride your dirt bikes.
Now, the guidelines, for example, you asked about camping. So BLM, Forest Service, you can camp anywhere as long as you're 100 feet from the road. And National Park Service, you got to be in a campground. As you get higher control, then all those things your usage gets more and more controlled. Bureau of Land Management, like Dino said, is the most wide open.
Yep. Now, ironically, you do understand that these unwanted lands are probably now the focus of much of the controversy in federal land management. We're not controversial about the parks and the forests and the farmer-owned land. That's not controversial. The controversial part is what do we do with this open land?
Yeah.
Do we put solar fields on it? Wind farms? Do we not? Do we allow you to camp on it, ride your bike? Do we use it as a Marine Corps testing station? Do we allow, 29 Palms to expand into BLM land so they can improve their gunnery range? I mean, what do we do? You know what I mean? What do you do with this land? Yeah, that's what Congress does. Congress decides what happens with BLM land. All right. The BLM has been historically criticized for serving the interests of ranchers that depend on Bureau grazing permits to the exclusion of other interests. Now, the 1976 passage of the Federal Land Policy and Land Management Act led to a change in BLM land management practices that now say that BLM is committed to multiple use and that of sustainable use, sustainable yield. It used to be. The BLM, remember how Neville was saying last week the BLM is about multiple use? It didn't used to be. It used to be actually serving the interests of cattle grazers. That changed in the 70s. Congress passed a law. Also, the BLM is tasked with examining its holdings and determine which is suitable for wilderness designation. So if some of this is so remote, maybe it's better off to designate it as a wilderness and actually let it be handled by the National Park Service. So the San Jacinto Wilderness Area that is located right north of Banning. It's an inaccessible mountain range relatively close to LA, but it's a wilderness area, which means you cannot overnight camp.
But you know what's interesting about that is they charge with that, again, Mexico, because actually it isn't the National Park Service, but they have to manage it themselves.
Oh, they have to manage the wilderness?
Under more stringent conditions. They have to monitor it, they have to make sure that it indeed is held pristine. Yeah, they manage. I didn't realize that until tonight either.
You know,
I knew that National Park Service didn't.
There
That's
are
a different
wildernesses.
designation.
Well,
Yeah,
there are wildernesses that are managed by the National Park
exactly.
Service.
I think those are within national park land, though.
Interesting. All right, fair enough. I would assume
Like
that they
San
handed over.
Gorgonio is,
Yeah.
I think, a wilderness inside of national park.
Oh,
I don't know.
yeah.
But I was going to ask about it because clearly it said, well, then we continue to manage them under the wilderness. So everybody runs around and declares the wilderness, makes their jobs pretty tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, hikers go up into those wilderness areas. They're not supposed to camp overnight, no campfires. They have pretty stringent rules about wilderness areas. It's basically roadless areas, anywhere you can't access by road. So, do you guys know where the Mount Jacinto or the San Jacinto Wilderness is? Do you guys know where Forest Falls is? Right, just go east, heading towards Banning, up and over that ridge, which most people do not hike, because you cannot hike, because it goes up to like 9,000 feet. And look, what's that? I don't know if Kyle's
It goes
been,
up
but-
to like 11. Oh, San Gorgonio is 11,000 something feet.
Yeah, it goes high. Some of the highest peaks right, in the continental United States are just in our back door. All right, continuing. Let's see here. The National Park Service, created in 1960, is directed to, quote, promote and regulate the use of federal areas, known as national parks, monuments, and reservations. The fundamental purpose of the parks is to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. You can read Theodore Roosevelt's, right, in this. That's just him talking, right? You can read it, yeah? National Park Service is again required to preserve and maintain monuments, reservations, and national parks. Now, there's an inherent conflict, guys, with this. Between preservation and its use as a major, as for tourism. Right? There's a major problem. There's 391 parks within the National Park Service jurisdiction, covering more than 84 million acres. And what's ironic is that the growth of the park system, the reason why we keep adding more parks to the National Park System is directly correspondent to the growth of the number of visitations. So the problem is the more visitors you have, the more impact you have in these pristine areas. So how do you handle this? Because the more visitors you have, the more people want to designate more parks. Just so you see how this works, for example, the number of holdings or units grew from 176 units in 1960 to 176 units in 1960, covering 26.2 million acres, to 333 units, covering 77 million acres by 1980. And then in 1980, Congress passed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act that doubled the acreage of the national park system. And then finally in 2006, Bush issued a presidential decree establishing the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in southern Utah, adding an additional 1.7 million acres of mostly roadless lands. So what do? The more people that come visit, the more likely they're going to want to support the parks. The more parks you're going to get, but the more people that visit, the more impact it has on the environment. You see the inherent conflict?
Yeah.
How do you keep it pristine if a million people are visiting sequoias? So what do they do now in the Grand Canyon? Do they just allow anybody to go through the Grand Canyon? Or what do they say? In order to keep it pristine, what do? They limit. They give you a permit, right? And you get that permit through a lottery. Yes. That's why they don't allow you just to camp anywhere in the National Park Service. You have to camp at specific locations. But it is a tension, isn't it? Because the more people visit parks, the more what? The more people like them, and the more we're willing as Americans to support the development of more parks. Ironic, do you see what I mean? It's not a what? It's a tough situation to be in, yeah. Absolutely. All right, last couple ones. Forest Service, created in 1905 as part of the Department of Agriculture. Forest Service manages 156 natural forests, 19 national grasslands, 17 land utilization projects in 44 states. The Forest Service holdings cover 191 million acres. There are two constituent groups that have an influence in Forest Service. Those we can label resource-using groups and those we can label recreation groups. The resource-using groups include timber, mining, and to a lesser degree grazing interests. Recreation groups include environmental organizations, hikers, hunters, and anglers. Now, the guiding principle of the Forest Service then is the greatest good to the greatest number in the longest run. And finally, we have the Fish and Wildlife Service, created in 1940, oversees 512 national wildlife refuges, 198 waterfowl protection areas, 50 waterfowl coordination areas, 65 national fish hatcheries, 9 major fish and wildlife research labs, and centers totaling more than 92 million acres. Most of the National Wildlife Refuge System, about 88%, is located in Alaska, in ANWR, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. You guys have heard of ANWR before? ANWR, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And that's it. I went over. My sincerest apologies.
Oh, no, thank you.
Hope you guys felt like you learned a little bit.
Yeah.
Now the PowerPoint will be up for Neville. And Neville, are we done?
We are done.
My apologies that we didn't get a chance to see the movie, guys. And hopefully we'll see it next week. Butterflies and bulldozers, right?
Yep.
Thank you, guys.
Mr. Noah, I'm